When I first got the idea for this video, I really wanted to start it with, the worst part about this game is the platform it's on, because A Way Out certainly looked like a game with a lot of potential to be an interesting and unique experience. After finishing it, I was completely right about its potential, although as you can probably tell from the title of the video, and the fact that I'm not starting it with what I wanted to start it with, it didn't quite live up to my expectations. The result is a painfully average game that could have been so much more than what it was. And that's about as spoiler free as I can be. The game is really short. It took me and my mate about 5 hours to beat it the first time through, including dicking around time, so there's barely anything to really talk about before spoilers. If the game piqued your interest at all before watching this video, you should probably go play it, because it isn't a bad game at all in case what I just said made it seem like one, and if you like the type of game that it is, you'll probably enjoy it a heck of a lot more than I did, although don't go into it expecting the next great revolution in video games. When analysing a video game, you can generally split it apart into many separate chunks that you can individually analyse, and then look at them and see how they all work together. Visuals, music, gameplay, controls, stories, difficulties, so on and so forth. These chunks of a game can be neatly divided under two key words. Video considers the presentation side of things. How well does a game look? How impactful is the soundtrack for what's going on? What atmosphere or tone is the game creating, if at all? Questions like these fall under here. The game side of things covers the parts where you press the buttons and do the things, the interactive element. While these can be used to describe the more obvious things while playing a game, obvious things that I hopefully don't have to explain, they can also be used to explore the video side of things in unique ways. The atmosphere, the story, or the dreaded lore that you put together yourself. Video games allow you to experience things in ways that other mediums, books and movies more specifically, simply can't do. There is a very big difference between watching someone survive a horrific situation and then being the someone surviving the horrific situation. One of the simplest and best examples that I can think of, and some people will probably cringe at what I'm about to say, is through a free browser game called DPO with 4 E's. It's a simple prey and predator experience. You start low in the food chain, eating plant life and running from the bigger predators for your survival, until you rank up and evolve to become the predator. Despite it not being very visually impressive, by simply being a game, it allows you to experience running from a larger predator fearful for your life, and later feel that sense of empowerment once you've become the threat of the ocean, fighting instead of flighting, which that's not going anywhere. Books and movies cannot possibly provide this experience, no matter how hard they try. You're not watching someone play through a predetermined outcome. You are the person influencing the outcome and experiencing the emotions that stories try to describe. On top of that, your quick thinking will decide if you make it to safety or not, and the fear and tension that builds within you as you wonder if you're going to make it is replaced with relief once you finally do. So why the hell am I bringing all of this up? Well, it's for two reasons. One is because I want to set a standard on how I look at games for the channel. When looking at this division of video and game, I'm in firm belief that a game either needs to be fantastic in one of these or great in both for it to be a high quality game. The second is because then my way of looking at A Way Out makes sense, because it doesn't really excel in either of these categories. That might sound weird to hear if you've only experienced A Way Out through its promotional material. It looks very much like a walking simulator style of game with a high focus on narrative and less of a focus on the game side of things. However, once you've played the game, you'll quickly find that it's trying to do both. It's certainly story driven and has a large focus on its narrative, with walking simulator-like elements, but there's also a copious amount of minigames and actual attempts at proper gameplay, in the more traditional teach and test way rather than the experience way. There's chase sequences, gunplay, escape room-like puzzles, novelty minigames, and quick-time events. A Way Out takes these two drastically different types of video games and throws them together without much thought. Instead of getting a story in video game format that takes full advantage of interactivity, we instead get a movie that we guide along with some mild interactions, sort of like a pop-up book, though the presentation is unique and interesting. And because of this obviously strong focus on the narrative and presentation side of things, the gameplay elements feel shoehorned in as afterthoughts, almost as if they were included just to justify it being a game in the first place. And since I just took a huge dump on the gameplay, I think that's a good time to transition into why I feel that way.
Like a real farmer.
As I mentioned earlier, there are 4 distinct types of gameplay present in A Way Out, although I feel like I should put a giant disclaimer here and say that this is how I'm dividing the gameplay. If you were to do your own analysis, it will likely be very different to mine. And these are as follows: QuickTime events, minigames, the gunplay, and the escape room-like puzzles. The common problem across all of these is that they all feel rushed and somewhat unfinished. I'll start with easily the most hateable of the gameplay elements, QuickTime events. I hate these with a passion. Pretty much all you do is respond to a button prompt and then the game does all the cool stuff for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that every QuickTime event is terrible. If the game wants to do something more cinematic without completely wrenching control from its player, then it's fine, but only if there's actual gameplay alongside it. If the game is solely relying on QuickTime events, I can't help but get bored and wonder why this wasn't just a cutscene. Hell, what am I saying? It basically is a cutscene, just with some tests to make sure you're still awake. The QuickTime events are also surprisingly forgiving considering how many of them are present throughout the game. There's only ever 3 buttons you can be prompted to press. The time you have to respond to the prompt isn't quick to pass at all, and pressing the wrong button doesn't even fail you. The only way to fail is to wait until you run out of time, which doesn't matter too much as the game has numerous generous checkpoints, so you're only ever going to lose a minute or 2 of progress for a fail at most. For a game that utilizes these so much, I'm oddly surprised that there was essentially no attempt for it to be challenging in any way, but maybe that's expecting too much from the laziest game mechanic of all time. The next is the minigames, where the game begins to feel more gamey. There's a set piece spectacle sections, then there's the more specific minigame sections within those set pieces, and then the actual minigames, and I have mixed feelings on all of these. I'll start with the actual minigames because I'm honestly dumbfounded as to why they're even in the game in the first place. Why can I play Connect 4, or horseshoes, or baseball, or darts? Why can we balance on wheelchairs? Why? I don't really know why these are in the game. They're useless distractions that stretch out the game time, I guess, but they do literally nothing aside from some small rivalry between you and your buddy. But if we wanted to compete, we'd play a better game. The others are clicker QuickTime event minigames. Throwing cards, starting the bike, and playing basketball, for instance. It's just something shit to click through while the other person is going through a cinematic moment. Which is nice, I guess, but again, it's just a distraction from the main game. I'm not even going to count these as parts of the main experience, as they don't add anything of value to the game. The set pieces are visually cool and interesting to look at, but they're not cool and interesting to experience. Many QuickTime events plagues all of these sections, albeit they're far more punishing here, but the checkpoints are still generous and frequent, so the difficulty is undermined. However, for the actual minigame sections within these, I can be positive since it tries to offer some gameplay, but it doesn't quite justify them all feeling awkward to play. I'm certain it has to do with the movements. The 2 playable characters, Leo and Vincent, just don't control as precisely as they should. More specifically, other games did it far better. Movement, walking and driving alike, is stiff and awkward to control, and it's difficult to explain why. I think most of it comes from the game telling you there's a dedicated sprint button, but then locking the speeds of your movement between gated sections. For example, in the laundry sequence scene, there's a section where you have to sneak past the guards, so while in this specific area, the game will force you to a crouch and you'll move at that speed. But once you've crossed the line to a safe area, the game will stand you up and you'll move at walking speed. It's also noticeable in the stick-up scene. When escaping, you're stuck in a slow run, and then as soon as you're outside, you break into an awkward sprint. You can also find yourself easily stuck on some objects, which is more noticeable while driving, where sometimes you can fail a section because you got stuck on some rocks and couldn't move off it before you got caught. Granted, the controls are good enough to comfortably beat the game, but it isn't great either and doesn't excuse it from criticism. And you're always on the move. In escape rooms, in a chase sequence, or in a minigame, you're always moving in one way or another, and this awkwardness seeps in and makes these sections less pleasant to play than they could have been. Awkward movement aside, when it comes to the more specific minigame sections, I enjoyed them. This Pac-Man chase sequence, the 2D fighter sequence, and the truck escape scene were all pretty good. Sure, they could be better, but the core idea behind these minigames is solid. A new interesting take on a common gameplay element, used for a few minutes and then forgotten about, which would be good if the gameplay was mostly these novelties back to back to back. While there are a few of them that aren't great and are on borderline walking simulator or QuickTime event levels of interesting, there were a few that stuck out to me as cool my first time through. On subsequent playthroughs, these weren't as cool, as the unpolished and clunky controls started to shine through. The gunplay is also plagued with the awkwardness of the movement, but what struck me as odd was that shooting the gun was clunky as well, which is strange for a part of the game that takes up a lot of time, including the climax. Going back to awkward movement, it also translates to awkward cover mechanics. There's a visual prompt for you to get into cover which you can accidentally press, and then there's no prompt to leave it, and while you're in cover, you're restricted to moving along it. So what's the problem, Joey? You need to learn how to play video games. Well, as you can probably see, in these combat sections you're forced to a crouch walk, which is the same stance that you have while in cover, so it's near impossible to tell if you're in cover or not, which makes movement even more awkward than it already was. Moving on to the part where you fire the gun, it's somewhat strange. There's a deliberate recoil on the gun which can be controlled, and while this is good, it's awkward as hell to realize that it's recoil. The increasing reticle makes it seem like you're just losing accuracy for reasons, and the only way to control it is to tediously stop and start your fire, which is horrible. I found the shotgun to be the most effective weapon, not only because it doesn't suffer from this problem, but because it's fantastic at close quarters while still being good at range, somehow. And you're going to be at range a lot in these encounters, since the AI is less than stellar. It seems that they can only react to one threat at a time, so if you try to be aggressive using the melee attacks and having fun, if you even knew that melee attacks existed, you'll eventually draw all the aggro and be forced into cover so you don't get killed. While they're all aggroed onto one player, the other can freely flank and take free shots on all the unprotected rears, and the AI will never react until it's too late. Being forced into cover and playing whack-a-mole with goons isn't fun, and even with some combat mechanics, you can't make them fun. Like the movements, these sections are bearable, but they're not fantastic either. Besides, appraising a section as bearable means that it's doing something wrong in one way or another. And finally, we get to the most interesting gameplay element of them all, the escape room scenarios. This is the part where I'd like to finally say that A Way Out is a forced co-op game, in case you didn't already know that. The reason why I'm pointing this out is because none of the gameplay elements I've described so far scream I'm the reason why this is co-op only. However, when we get to puzzles and escape rooms, it's finally here where the co-op gameplay will finally shine through. Or at least that's what I thought. These sections play are all pretty much the same. There's an end objective and a bunch of stuff you can interact with. Interact with the stuff in the right order and you can solve the puzzle. It has a lot of potential to be good, but in practice, A Way Out doesn't really try to do anything interesting at all. These rooms can be cool the first time through, but they can be blitzed through in a minute or two if you know what you're doing, which really highlights the simplicity of them. I'll use the first of these scenarios as my base example, since it's the easiest to show why I'm so disappointed in these sections. To set the scene, Leo needs to steal away this chisel, but he can't be spotted by the guard or the nurse on the way there or back. It then becomes Vincent's job to distract these two, allowing Leo to slip by undetected, which sounds great, but in practice it falls short. It opens with Vincent calling the nurse, which Leo slips past until he's stopped by a guard. Vincent then taps the window, startling the guard and spilling his coffee, which allows Leo to slip past and grab the chisel, and then returns to bed. And that's it, that's the entire section. The stakes during this section is that if they get caught, they'll be sent to the previous check, solitary confinement, but in gameplay, there's no tension at all. When Vincent first distracts this nurse, she cleans the sink indefinitely, until Leo has progressed far enough to trigger her turning back around. Same goes for this guard after Vincent caused him to spill his coffee. He won't leave until Leo has taken the chisel, which is bad for the gameplay since there's no tension or stakes involved and there's very little reason to be invested. Sure, there's narrative-based tension, but without it being translated into some sort of real gameplay tension, it's impossible for anyone to actively experience it. It's just something we passively go along with because the game expects us to. But Joey, that's the first one, it's allowed to be a little simple. And you have a point there, but the later ones don't get any more interesting or complicated, they remain around the same level of difficulty. The laundry scenario is even more simple and restrictive. You grab a cart, fill it with some sheets, and hide in it to sneak past the guards. Then break a machine, which you can't break until one player has progressed past the guards for some reason. Use that distraction to sneak past another guard, steal the sheets, and then you're done. The machine gets even simpler.
I want you to turn down that attitude a little.
It's literally just a juggling act between the two people until you eventually get it to your cell.
What's going on?
Later escape rooms, which are still sort of puzzles but not really, even loses all tension altogether. You can leisurely dick around at your own pace, and it's in these sections where the game becomes a walking simulator, which I doubt was the intention given the evident attempts at gameplay. There is one good escape room, the cell escape scene, where one person is escaping while the other keeps watch to avoid detection from the guards. There's at least some real tension built and a reliance on cooperation for the gameplay, which is just a bunch of quick time events, but you're rewarded for completing them faster, so at least tries to be a game rather than just a prompt. But even in this room, the challenge is barely present. There's only ever one guard patrolling at a time, so if you're careful you can never be caught, since they never investigate the noise you're making, somehow.
I'm freezing. Could I have some extra sheets?
No, it's not gonna happen.
The reason why this section sticks out to me is because it at least tries to be challenging, which is something the other rooms don't do. I'm going to return to the first escape room and modify it with all of my game developer ideas from all of my real-world game developer experience. The core premise is still the same, except the nurse and guard are dynamic, meaning that the guard patrols instead of jerking off, and you have to actively try to keep the nurse in your room, so she doesn't notice that Leo is gone. And for the sake of increasing challenge, we'll make the chisel further away from the infirmary. Why the hell not? In this new section, Vincent is constantly talking to the nurse and actively keeping her distracted, while also having to keep an eye on the guard and distract him for Leo. Juggling these is the challenge for Vincent. The challenge for Leo is grabbing the chisel as quickly as possible, since Vincent's smooth talking isn't going to last forever, while also staying quiet as any loud sound would cause the nurse to investigate and she'll immediately notice that Leo is gone. This scenario not only creates interesting and challenging gameplay, it also creates tension through the gameplay rather than relying on the narrative to provide it, allowing players to experience the situation rather than being told and shown it, and then just guiding it along. This modification also forces cooperation and communication between the players, which is something the game currently doesn't force at all, which is the most surprising part about A Way Out's forced co-op experience. It doesn't do anything with it. It never truly forces any communication, since I can always see what's happening on my partner's screen, and the co-op gameplay sections are very relaxed, to the point where it almost feels like one can play through the entire game on their own. And that's because you can. Well, I did anyway, and it took me 5 hours, no more time than usual. While playing the game on my own, with Vincent on the keyboard and Leo on the gamepad, I was astonished at how often I could control the two individually, meaning I play a part as Vincent, then switch to the gamepad and play a part as Leo, then switch back to the keyboard for Vincent's next part, so on and so forth, in this my turn, your turn fashion, which is actively embraced in the hospital escape scene for some reason, which blows my mind as there was so much potential there. Each player's choices during their own escape could have impacted the other's escape, either positively or negatively, which again would have forced some level of quick thinking and communication between the players. In its current state, the most cooperation the game demands are doing a co-op QuickTime event, which is honestly pushing it for a co-op only game, and it's incredibly easy to do solo. It's also easy to notice how linear everything is, including some of the set piece spectacles. Often I will be holding forward on one character, while doing a more precise QuickTime event on the other, and then switching over, my turn, your turn. The chase sequences were also very linear, just hold forward and you'll reach the goal in no time. The only remotely challenging sections while playing it in this way were the minigames, which is unsurprising since this is where the game becomes the most gamey, but its challenge stems from it's really hard to use a gamepad and a keyboard and mouse at the same time, more than the game is trying to be hard. I could still get through it though, awkwardly and stupidly, sure, but it was possible. And I think this is where majority of A Way Out's disappointment comes from for me. What gameplay that's present just isn't engaging or interesting enough to really get into and thoroughly enjoy, and its cooperative gameplay elements are practically non-existent. You might think that I'm being too harsh on the game. A Way Out isn't trying to be a game, it's trying to be a narrative experience, and while I'll strongly disagree with that since everything I've talked about so far has been about A Way Out trying to be a game, you might be right about my expectations. Maybe I am being far too harsh on the gameplay side of things, since it isn't really trying too hard to be a game, but imagine how great it could have been if it did. With the game part out of the way, we can move on to the video part of A Way Out. This is the focus of the game with an interesting presentation style, but the narrative being presented is filled with far too many cliches and has a terrible ending. I'll get the cliches out of the way first. Here they all are.
You're gonna pay for this!
The presentation side of things is something that I can be positive about. It's a split screen only game, even when playing online, and I think that the split screen was used quite creatively. One person could be in a cinematic and the other could still be doing stuff, and I thought that was neat. It's also good to see their perspective in story segments, although I can't help but wonder how good the gameplay sections could have been if you couldn't see the other person's perspective, especially in the cell escape scene. It's impressive how much tension and communication gets cut just because whoever is doing the escaping also gets front row seats in keeping watch. There's also another scene in the laundry scenario when one person is in the cart. It just doesn't mean anything since you can screen cheat. But from a cinematic point of view, I think it was used quite creatively. The other aspects are the actual story and the choices you get to make along the way, which are all pointless. Choices appear often, either in obvious Leo's Way, Vincent's Way choices, or in escape rooms where it isn't obvious you have the choice to begin with. Choices at first seem impactful. The first major one you're given is during the prison escape sequence. Leo suggests hijacking a police car where Vincent wants to climb under the bridge. Each choice leads to a different gameplay section, but both choices end up at the same points. If you choose Leo's Way, you steal the car and slowly drive over the bridge until you get inspected and inevitably caught. Leo then floors it and crashes, leading to an escape on foot. If you climb under the bridge Vincent's Way, you make it to the other side undetected, but one person must climb up to knock out this police officer to let the other pass underneath undetected. After knocking them out, the player on top will be caught, leaving the undetected player to save him. This causes a scene leading to the exact same escape on foot. For another example of choice, we can return to the laundry scene. To get the car, you can either knock this guy out with Leo or bribe him with Vincent, but no consequence ever arises from this choice, if you even realize it was a choice to begin with. All roads lead to Rome. Even in some Leo's Way, Vincent's Way choices, there's no impact. How you defuse the situation with the arms dealer doesn't matter, nor does how you gain access to the construction site, which is odd since these choices are made at the very beginning of these scenes, and the actual choices are very different, so some consequence for them should be expected.
What's your name?
What do you need my name for?
What's your name?
All right, it's Larry.
All right, Larry. This is how it's gonna be.
We're here to check if this site is up to code.
Jesus Christ. Another inspection?
The lack of consequence is even present in the gameplay, especially in probably the most complicated escape room of them all, the convenience store robbery. This escape room, at first, looks like it is littered with different choices and different ways to get in and out, but barely any of these choices matter. The only ones that have any impact on the gameplay is, who do you give the gun to, did you get this guy out of the shop or not, and did you sabotage the phone? That's it. Talking to the jewelry man does nothing, neither does talking to the clerk, and the other things you can do are pretty pointless. Even if you replay this section over and over to see different variations on the gameplay, you'll be disappointed because all roads lead to Rome. I made a flowchart detailing all the possible choices and variations of this scenario, and that's literally it. No matter what you do, the main chain of events is identical every time, and any divergence from the main path generally results in a game over. The strange thing is that while the game wants to offer choice, it also isn't prepared to deal with how the player might react to a situation. If Vincent starts the heist, the jittery man will flee later into the heist, and shooting at him will stop his escape and prevent him from alerting the cops down the street. However, the same gunshot doesn't stop the clerk from loading her gun, and I fired it at her a dozen times. If the man and the phone are left alone during the heist, he'll call the cops, and he will only stop if you shoot or interact with him. You can have 2 guns dead in his face and he will be unintimidated. If you take too long robbing the safe in the back and don't stop the clerk from pulling her gun out, you get a game over. There's no other way out of this room, no creative way to disarm her, nothing. You are forced to walk out and you get shot on sight. The only choice with any actual weight to it is if you give Leo the gun. The jittery man flees immediately, and since Vincent can't have a gun at the start and Leo is stuck in a cutscene, it's impossible to stop him, and you can't tackle him for some reason, which I don't get either. Everything else is just a small variation on the same sequence of events. So why give us the choice to begin with? If I make a choice and still succeed, that choice holds no consequence, but if I make a choice and there is a consequence, it's generally a game over, and then my choice is undone at the reloaded checkpoint, which means that there's no choice, there's just the illusion of choice. If all the roads lead to Rome, why not give me one scenic route instead of the choice of a handful of bland and boring ones? I might be expecting way too much here though, and this might be unreasonable criticism, but the game offers choice so often throughout the game that I feel like they should mean something, but they just don't. It's doubly strange because A Way Out is a co-op game, and these choices are the only times where communication is forced, and an eventual agreement has to be reached, so I don't understand why they're meaningless in both a gameplay sense and a story sense. Speaking of which, the game's story is the only thing I haven't yet talked about, and for the most part it's good, except when it isn't, and it's especially terrible at the end. I could go through a step-by-step walkthrough of the entire story, but honestly, the actual story doesn't really matter all that much. All we need to know is that Leo and Vincent share a mutual lust for getting revenge on a man named Harvey, the story's main villain. Harvey and Leo worked together, but during a deal, Harvey killed their buyer and left Leo to the sharks for a clean getaway, and Harvey killed Vincent's brother and framed him for it. The story is simply a series of events that details them getting a way out of prison to finding a way in to Harvey and killing him. They both start imprisoned. Now they need to escape, so they gather the tools to escape and do so. Now they're on the run. Now they need to ride away from the prison. Now the cops found them, so they need to escape. Now they need to find where Harvey is. Now they need money and guns to confront Harvey. Now they're being attacked by an assassin. Now Vincent's wife gave birth to their first child and they need to go visit her. Now the cops found them, so they need to escape. Now they need to travel where Harvey is and confront and kill him. That was long and repetitive, but hopefully my point isn't lost in translation. There's no story being told here, it's just shit happening and Leo and Vincent reacting to them. It's strange to say that the main story of a story-based game doesn't matter much, but it really doesn't. I tried for hours to make some sense of it, but I honestly have nothing, which is I guess where I have the most criticism. We're supposed to hate Harvey because he's the main antagonist, but the game doesn't really do anything to establish his character. He has 2 real scenes before you confront him, a standalone scene where he kills more buyers, and the scene where he betrays Leo, and that's it. He's a greedy arsehole. That's all the character he's given. It's the same for the families of the 2 main characters. Linda and Alex's characters begins and ends with Leo's supportive wife and happy son, and Carol is Vincent's unhappy wife since their marriage is struggling. Nothing more is established about them. The only conversations that they're involved in is talking about how much of a dick Harvey is, and how much Harvey fucked their lives, and nothing about themselves is ever introduced. This is doubly strange because both the game's endings revolve around these characters' interactions with Leo and Vincent, but since we know next to nothing about them, it's almost impossible to be invested. It's also hard to take the story seriously, although I may be alone in this. I feel as if there's a complete disrespect for tone. The core story being told is Leo and Vincent's character development, and how they grow through each other, which is a serious story. Leo is cocky, arrogant, and hot-headed, but a loving husband and father, which is the complete opposite of Vincent, who is calm, collected, and diplomatic, but struggling with his marriage. And this dynamic between the 2 characters is interesting, but when you go from inmates abuse setting up the scene that you're disempowered, to overpowering the same guards in your lazy escape scene, or having a sweet family reunion after escaping GTA Division cops on a beat-up truck, slowing them down by shooting their cars with a shotgun, or having Vincent hold his newborn child for the first time, and then not even 5 minutes later, this happens.
Get in! Someone grab
It makes it kind of hard to take the serious moments seriously when any serious tone is completely undermined with bombastic spectacle. Which is a shame because Leo and Vincent's dynamic and development is honestly quite good. The two initially begin completely at odds. Leo doesn't want anything to do with Vincent and only reluctantly teams up with him. Then throughout the game, you see Leo become more open to Vincent and even voluntarily giving Vincent advice about saving his marriage. Advice Vincent takes on board without a second thought. You even see Vincent rubbing off on Leo as he becomes calmer and more collected, even though occasionally he can revert to his old self, but you know, baby steps. The dynamic between these two characters is about becoming better men than they otherwise would have through this unlikely friendship that's been formed. You see these characters grow together and warm up to each other, see their wooden interactions evolve into casual banter, and see their stories get more personal as time goes on. It never feels forced either. Their relationship develops organically, and their trust in each other builds about as quickly as trust would build between two people doing stunts like this. However, this good and interesting dynamic isn't enough to save the shitfest that is everything else. Leo and Vincent's relationship with their families and Harvey, the main antagonist and driving force of the plot mind you, are underdeveloped, and it makes it really hard to care about them. The spectacle of Harvey's death is cool, I guess, but you just don't experience Harvey being a dick enough to justify experiencing this overly brutal death. It just isn't satisfying. Not that the game really gives you any chance to reflect on it, since immediately after his death, you're on the run from his reinforcements. It's almost as if the game knows that the only thing going for it is the dynamic between the two lead characters, and instead of improving the story surrounding them, it instead throws shit at you to keep you engaged up until the very end. Which, surprise surprise, does not end with Harvey's death. After Leo and Vincent's journey of finding where Harvey is, getting what's necessary to confront him, and then flying to Mexico to kill him, they return home and are immediately arrested. It's revealed here that Vincent was an undercover cop the whole time and moves to arrest Leo. The key moment that linked Leo and Vincent is the purchase of the stolen gem gone wrong. Leo and Harvey are selling it to a keen buyer, who's Vincent's brother undercover. The deal goes south, Harvey shoots and kills the buyer, leaves Leo behind and escapes with the money and the gem. Vincent loses his brother and then uses Leo's aid to exact revenge. Upon hearing this, Leo takes Vincent hostage, and after a long chase scene,
Aim for the engine! We need him alive!
Vincent and Leo find each other fighting to the death, which is so stupid. Firstly, the fact that Vincent kept this information hidden is stupid. The entire narrative has been focused on Leo and Vincent learning to trust each other, since they've been working towards the same goal, Harvey's death, which they obtain. What part about the plot prevents Vincent from telling Leo, hey mates, I'm an undercover cop, we're going to kill Harvey and then things are going to turn out good for you, or something like that? Why does he never tell him? Then why does Leo treat this like a personal betrayal? Especially after Vincent offers to reward him for his services by reducing his sentence, and especially after Harvey personally betrays him. Leo's response to this revelation seems like an overreaction, shoehorned in for shock value, especially since Vincent doesn't really backstab Leo, as they already killed Harvey and exacted their revenge. Then we get to the actual fight to the death, which makes no sense. It makes sense for Leo to attack Vincent, sure, but it makes no sense for it to end in death on either side. Leo's entire character development has been about being a better and smarter man. This is a little more up for debate than Vincent's development, but it does make sense. Leo is a criminal, and he wants to get rid of that status for his son. He really only cares about his family after all. He's only living this life because that's the only life he's ever known, and Vincent sheds new light on that, showing that it is possible to live a life free of crime. So where does killing a man and leaving a newborn without a father fit in the path of becoming a better man, especially for family man Leo? There's also a crucial inconsistency if Leo kills Vincent, because he's killing him purely because he betrayed him. So then why doesn't he kill Emily right here? She betrayed him too. And while Vincent's family-related character development doesn't really fit in the fight, his base character does. He's the calm, collected, diplomatic type, diffusing situations discreetly with his words. Hence, if he wins the fight, it should never, ever end with death. He should disarm and arrest him, not kill him. But Vincent resorted to violence if he had to. When Vincent kills Leo, he's beat halfway to death. It should be easy, incredibly easy, to arrest him from this position, but instead you shoot him because reasons. The fight just makes no sense, unless you destroy both characters. They're no longer developed Vincent and Leo, they're common crook and cop, complete strangers. All the character development is gone, vanished, kaput, which for a narrative-based game, based on this narrative, isn't fantastic. But then, right after one of them dies, the game suddenly remembers all the character development that happened. If Leo wins, he immediately feels regret, which is a complete 180 on his personality and attitude during the fight.
Had enough? I got plenty more bullets. You hear that, you piece of shit? You're a dead man. I'm just getting started. You're gonna pay for this.
He then takes Vincent's letter and delivers it to Carol, while still showing regret for what he did, and then escapes his family, while still showing obvious regrets, which means that Vincent did make him a better man after all, and Leo can finally try a life free of crime. So then why did Leo kill Vincent at all if the guilt was clearly going to overwhelm him? Why did Leo kill Vincent if he knew that it left the family fatherless? Why? If Vincent wins, he shows no regret whatsoever. Sure, he shows some sympathy towards Leo as he dies, but then he moves on like nothing happened. He tells Linda of his passing, although the game doesn't show us how truthful he was to her, and then he's immediately back to saving his marriage, showing no remorse for murdering Leo in cold blood, or for what he did to Leo's family. This reaction is actually in character, but the problem with this ending is Vincent killing Leo in the first place, which with how Vincent's character is established throughout the game, makes no sense. A far better ending would have been to have Vincent and Leo both survive. Leo is initially hurt and dumbfounded, but Vincent manages to calm him down with his diplomatic nature, offering him a shorter sentence, and maybe even manages to get him out of prison on parole. Vincent does this because he doesn't see him as just another one of Harvey's goons anymore. Leo is a person too, and isn't deserving of his usual harsh attitude towards criminals. This allows Leo to live with his family free of crime, and Vincent uses Leo's advice to save his marriage with Carol. Both men are redeemed in their own ways, and they leave living happier lives than they otherwise would have. Sure, it's a cliche ending, but the game is riddled with cliches, so it would fit right in. It would at least be a better ending than how it currently ends, which contradicts everything that has been established about these two characters. It isn't really a suitable ending, as it relies way too hard on shock value and an effective use of brilliant music to play at your heartstrings, rather than being a satisfying finish to the narrative. Bringing it all back together, the individual parts that make a way out the game that it is are underwhelming, and it feels like these underwhelming parts were just thrown together, and this was the result. The game feels unfinished, and not in a buggy technical mess way. It feels like it needed more time to polish the parts of the game that had the potential to be interesting, engaging, and potentially even challenging, as well as the time to fix the ending, although I may be alone in this observation, and that's fine. What I think everyone can agree on though is that A Way Out is a really disappointing title, with so much untapped potential resting just beneath the surface, screaming for someone to give it life. This game really did have the potential to be a fantastic experience, and it's such a shame to see it fall short. Thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you next time.